The campfire smoke curled into the cold night air, carrying with it the smell of burnt meat and damp wood. The soldiers sat in uneven circles, their laughter rising above the crackle of flames, sharp and mocking. Their voices always seemed to find the same subject, circling back like vultures to a carcass, her. Kayla sat on the far edge of the gathering, her hands resting against the worn leather of her boots, staring into the embers as though the fire might swallow the sting of their words. She was broader than most of them, her shoulders thick, her waist heavy, her steps never graceful like the slender women they praised in tavern tales. From the day she had first picked up a spear, whispers followed her. Too slow, too heavy, not fit for battle. Even now, with years of training behind her, scars on her arms that told the truth of her endurance, they still laughed when her name was spoken. "Look at her," one of the younger fighters jeered, raising his mug of sour ale toward Kayla without shame. "When the enemy comes, she'll scare them with her size alone. Who needs a blade when she can crush them just by sitting on them?" The men roared with laughter, ale spilling from their cups, the sound carrying cruelly in the still night. Kayla kept her eyes fixed on the fire. She had learned long ago not to show how deeply the ridicule cut, but every insult was another stone piled upon her chest. She remembered her father's words before he had fallen to raiders years ago: "Strength is not always beauty, Kayla. But strength will outlast mockery." She clung to that truth like a weapon sharper than any steel. Her silence only fueled their boldness. Another soldier, older and missing 2 teeth, smirked as he leaned toward his comrades. "Aye, but the enemy might mistake her for a wall. Imagine their disappointment when it starts moving." More laughter, louder this time. Kayla forced herself to breathe slowly, to keep her hands from curling into fists. She had broken a man's jaw once for saying less, and though the satisfaction had been sweet, the punishment had been weeks of latrine duty and another round of whispered ridicule that she could not control her temper. She would not give them that victory again. What they did not see was how each night, when their voices dimmed and their drunken bodies slumped into restless sleep, Kayla trained. She trained harder than any of them. When the moon cast silver light across the camp, she hefted her axe again and again, striking wood until her muscles screamed. She ran the ridges until her lungs burned, climbed stone walls until her fingers bled. Alone in the quiet, she honed herself not into the graceful blade they all revered, but into an unstoppable force of endurance and will. She was not fast, but she did not break. She was not slender, but her body carried strength in every line. She was not the beauty of songs, but she would be the terror in the enemy's last breath. That night, as the mocking carried on, the war horn split the air. The sound was harsh, urgent, echoing across the hills. The laughter died in an instant, cups dropped, hands reached for steel. Kayla rose before the others, her axe already in her hand, the firelight flashing along its edge. Her heart steadied with a rhythm she knew well: battle. The scouts had warned of raiding bands, but no one had expected the enemy leader himself to come, a giant among men, a warlord whose size and cruelty had become legend. They said he stood a full head taller than the tallest soldier, his arms like tree trunks, his armor blackened by the fires of 100 villages. Children were hushed with stories of him. Men swore to the gods they would never face him in single combat. Tonight, Kayla would see if those stories were truth. The ground trembled before he even appeared, the sound of heavy footsteps rolling across the earth. Torches flared in the distance, enemy soldiers spilling across the darkened plain like ants pouring from a broken hill. And at their center he came. The giant leader towered above them, his helm crowned with jagged horns, his weapon a blade so broad it looked like it could cleave horse and rider in one stroke. The men around Kayla stiffened, and for the first time that night, their laughter was gone, replaced with the sour smell of fear. She tightened her grip on her axe, her jaw set. This was no tavern tale, no drunken jest. This was flesh and blood, steel and bone, and she would prove herself not with words, but with the language of battle. As the enemy army surged forward, Kayla's comrades shouted and scrambled to meet them, shields locking, spears thrusting. The clash of metal rang out, 1,000 sparks lighting the darkness. Kayla charged, her heavy frame barreling through the chaos, every mocking word she had ever heard pounding in her ears like a drum. She was no wall, no joke, no mistake. She was a storm wrapped in flesh, and tonight, the storm would fall upon the giant leader himself. The battlefield erupted into madness, steel clashing against steel, screams tearing through the air like ragged banners. Kayla plunged into the fray, the weight of her axe familiar and reassuring in her hands. Around her, soldiers fought in desperate knots, shields splintering, spears breaking against armored chests. The smell of blood and smoke thickened the air until breathing itself felt like swallowing ash. She moved without hesitation, each swing of her weapon carving space in the press of enemies, her strength sending men stumbling backward, their laughter from nights before replaced now with panicked cries as they struggled to keep their ground. For Kayla, every strike was more than survival, it was proof. Proof that her size, mocked and derided, carried power they could never match. Ahead, she glimpsed the towering shadow of the enemy leader, his massive blade carving arcs through men who dared to face him. He fought with the confidence of one who had never known defeat, every strike casual and brutal as if swatting aside insects. His army pressed forward with renewed fervor each time his voice bellowed across the field, a guttural roar that sent shivers down spines. Kayla felt the tremor in her own chest but gritted her teeth against it. Fear was nothing new. She had lived with the gnawing edge of it since childhood, when her own people doubted her worth. Fear would not rule her now. She forced her way closer, shoving aside friend and foe alike in her determination. One enemy soldier lunged with a spear, its point glancing off her shoulder armor. The impact rattled through her, but instead of faltering she caught the shaft in one hand, yanked it forward with a roar, and slammed the flat of her axe against the man's skull. He crumpled and she pressed onward, her lungs burning with effort. The rhythm of battle was harsh and unrelenting, but her training in the solitude of countless nights had hardened her for this. Where others began to slow, Kayla's strength only surged. She was a boulder rolling downhill, unstoppable, gathering momentum with every life she struck aside. The enemy leader finally turned his head, sensing the force that cut a path toward him. Their eyes met across the chaos, his small and sharp within the monstrous helm, hers burning like coals in the storm of battle. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to narrow to just the two of them. He raised his colossal sword and pointed it toward her, a challenge that sent shouts rippling across the field. Both sides faltered in their fighting, drawn by the magnetism of what was about to unfold. Soldiers staggered back, creating an impromptu circle around them, the clash of weapons falling into a tense silence. Kayla's comrades stared wide-eyed, disbelief etched on their faces that she, the subject of their jests, was now the one standing before the terror of their enemies. The giant leader laughed, a low, mocking rumble that carried over the din of the battle. "You?" he sneered, his voice booming through the metal of his helm. "They send you to face me? Too slow. Too soft. I'll split you in two with one swing." His words were an echo of everything Kayla had ever endured, every insult condensed into the sneer of a single man. Yet instead of weakening her, the familiarity steeled her spine. She lifted her axe, her arms steady, her breath measured. "Try," she growled, her voice raw but unshaking. The duel began with a thunderous strike from the giant sword, descending toward her with the weight of a falling mountain. Kayla braced her axe in both hands, catching the blow with a reverberating clang that numbed her arms to the bone. The ground itself seemed to quake beneath the force, but she held. Her knees bent, muscles screaming, but she did not yield. Gasps rose from the crowd of soldiers. Few had ever seen anyone withstand a single strike from their leader. With a guttural roar, Kayla twisted, shoving the blade aside and swinging her axe in a wide arc. The giant jerked back, narrowly avoiding the edge, and his laughter died into a growl. They circled each other, predator and prey, though neither could yet tell which role they would play. His strikes were monstrous, each one intended to end the fight in a single blow. Kayla's style was different. She knew she could never match his reach or raw size, but she could endure. Every time his blade crashed against her axe, every time her boots slid across the dirt, she rose again. Sweat slicked her face, blood from shallow cuts traced lines down her arms, yet her eyes never left his. She was waiting. Waiting for the moment when his arrogance, his reliance on overwhelming power, would leave an opening. Around them, the armies held their breath, the battle forgotten in the shadow of the duel. For Kayla's comrades, shame gnawed at them as they recalled their laughter, their cruel jokes. None of them had dared face the giant. None of them would have stood this long against him. And yet the woman they had mocked as clumsy and unworthy now bore the brunt of his fury. The truth settled in their hearts like a weight they could not shake. The giant leader lunged, his massive blade carving downward in a strike meant to cleave her from crown to heel. Kayla sidestepped at the last possible instant, the sword slamming into the earth with a shuddering impact that sent soil flying. The ground trembled beneath the force, but for the first time he was off balance. Kayla seized the chance, raising her axe high and slamming it against his armored side with a ringing blow that dented the steel. He roared, staggering backward, surprise flashing in his eyes. For the first time, the invincible warlord bled, The roar of the giant shook the battlefield, a sound so deep it rattled in the ribs of every soldier nearby. His massive hand clutched the dent in his armor where Kayla's axe had struck, blood seeping through the crack like dark wine spilling from a broken cask. For years, no warrior had dared lay a meaningful wound on him. His legend had been carved in victories, his cruelty reinforced by his size and the ease with which he destroyed men. Yet here before both armies stood Kayla, panting, sweat-soaked, her axe trembling in her hands but her stance unbroken. She had made him bleed, and that truth spread like wildfire through the hearts of every soldier watching. The warlord's eyes burned with fury as he swung again, his blade whistling through the air like a hurricane. Kayla ducked, the edge missing her head by inches. The wind of the swing tore strands of her hair loose, but she pressed forward, swinging her axe at his legs. The blow struck, biting into his greave, sparks leaping where steel met steel. He staggered again, more from the audacity of her defiance than the wound itself, and roared in frustration. His voice thundered across the field. "You are nothing," he bellowed, his words spittle-laced and venomous. "Nothing but a clumsy beast." The insult struck a chord, but instead of wounding her, they fueled her. Every cruel laugh she had endured in the barracks, every whisper behind her back, every mocking cheer at her expense now became her shield. She had been called a beast, and now she would show them what kind of beast she truly was. She met his glare, her chest heaving. "If I am a beast," she shouted back, her voice carrying across the stunned silence of both armies, "then you are prey." Her words cut deeper than her axe, for the warlord's pride was as massive as his body. With a guttural snarl he charged, his blade raised high. The earth shook with his steps, his momentum like that of a boulder tumbling from a mountain. Soldiers scrambled out of his path, unwilling to be crushed in the storm. Kayla did not move. She planted her feet, raised her axe and waited. At the last instant, when his blade came crashing down, she twisted sideways, feeling the shockwave of his strike tear the air where she had stood. His sword smashed into the dirt, gouging a trench. Before he could recover, Kayla swung, her axe slamming into his exposed wrist. The giant bellowed as blood splattered, his grip faltering for the first time. The crowd erupted. Gasps and shouts filled the night, and Kayla's comrades could hardly believe what they were seeing. The woman they had mocked for her bulk now danced with the warlord himself, her size no weakness but a fortress of endurance. Every time his strikes shook the ground, she rose again. Every time he tried to crush her, she turned his strength against him. Where others had been broken by the sheer weight of his power, Kayla absorbed it, her body forged by years of silent, unrecognized training. But the fight was far from over. The warlord, though wounded, was far from defeated. His eyes blazed with wrath, and his swings became even more reckless, each one a deadly storm that forced Kayla to give ground. The sheer force of him was overwhelming, and with every block her arms burned, her muscles screaming under the strain. The crowd watched in awe as she absorbed blow after blow, the sound of steel clashing echoing like thunder. Dust rose around them, the duel transforming into a whirlwind of motion and raw force. Kayla knew she could not meet him head-on forever. Already her breaths came ragged, her strength flagging. She remembered her father's words again, "Strength will outlast mockery." She whispered them under her breath like a prayer, and with renewed determination, she steadied herself. This fight was not about glory, not about proving herself to men who had never believed in her. It was about survival, hers and that of everyone who stood behind her. If she fell, the enemy's morale would soar and her people's hearts would crumble. She could not allow that. As the giant lunged once more, Kayla shifted her weight, letting his momentum carry him forward. His blade swept wide, missing her, and for a brief moment, his chest was exposed. She seized the chance, her axe flashing in the firelight, striking across his. Just sparks flew, armor split, and blood welled crimson. The warlord roared again, staggering backward, rage contorting his face beneath the helm. It was not just pain in his eyes now but something new, doubt. For the first time in his reign of terror he faced someone who did not break. The soldiers on both sides could sense it. The circle tightened, every man and woman holding their breath. The battle around them had ceased entirely, the fate of hundreds now hung on the outcome of this single duel. Kayla could feel their eyes upon her, but she shut out everything except the giant before her. Her chest ached, her arms trembled, but her spirit only grew sharper. She had endured years of laughter, years of being told she would never be enough. All of it had been leading here to this moment, when her size, her strength, her unyielding will would become the weapon that turned the tide. The warlord spat blood onto the ground, his lips curling in a snarl. You think you can defeat me? He growled, voice ragged. I am the mountain. I am the storm. You are nothing. Kayla tightened her grip on her axe, her voice steady though her body screamed with exhaustion. Mountains can fall, she said. Storms pass. But I remain. And with that, she charged, ready to meet him again, the world narrowing to the clash of steel and the roar of hearts that knew the end of the duel was drawing near. The night pulsed with tension as Kayla and the giant warlord clashed again, their weapons sparking like fire against the darkness. Each strike echoed like thunder, each step pounded into the earth as though the gods themselves had descended to test their strength. Kayla's arms felt like lead, every muscle burning from the relentless struggle, but she forced her body to obey, forced her legs to steady beneath her. Pain was nothing new, she had lived with it all her life, the pain of mockery, of endless drills in solitude, of forcing her body beyond its limits when no one else believed in her. Now that pain became her armor, her reminder that she had endured worse than this. The warlord's face twisted into a mask of fury. His pride was bleeding as much as his body, and the thought that a woman, this woman, mocked and underestimated, had wounded him before both armies drove him into a frenzy. He lifted his enormous sword high and swung with reckless force, each blow carving furrows into the ground, splitting shields, shattering spears. Kayla absorbed them all, her axe a wall of steel, her stance a bulwark against his storm. The shock of every impact rattled through her bones, but she held, sweat flying from her brow, her teeth bared in a grimace that was equal parts pain and determination. Around them, silence reigned among the soldiers. The duel had become more than a fight between two warriors. It was a symbol, a story being carved into memory. To Kayla's comrades, shame gnawed deeper with each passing moment. The woman they had mocked for her size now stood as their only shield against the enemy's might. To the enemy soldiers, fear grew in their eyes as they watched their invincible leader stumble, bleed, and falter against someone they had dismissed before the fight even began. The giant lunged, trying to end it with sheer speed, his sword crashing down with the weight of a falling tree. Kayla twisted aside, her breath ragged, and slammed her shoulder into his chest with all her strength. The impact was like colliding with a wall, but the warlord staggered back a step, surprise flickering in his eyes. Kayla did not hesitate. She lifted her axe and struck at his knee, the blow crunching into armor with a sound like breaking stone. The giant roared, stumbling as his leg gave under him, the earth trembling as his massive frame faltered. Shouts erupted from the ranks, voices calling her name, some in disbelief, others in rising hope. Kayla heard them distantly as though from another world. Her entire focus was locked on the warlord before her. She saw him as he was, not as the legend they had painted him. He was flesh and blood, powerful but not untouchable. He bled. He hurt. And he feared. That fear was small now, but it was growing, and Kayla would feed it until it consumed him. He swung again, desperate, his blade sweeping low. Kayla leapt back, her heavy frame moving with a speed born not of grace but of necessity, and the blade cut only air. Seizing the moment, she brought her axe down in a brutal arc that slammed against his shoulder. The armor cracked under the force and he bellowed in agony, falling to one knee. The ground shook as his weight collapsed onto it, his breath coming in ragged growls. The soldiers around them gasped as the unthinkable happened. Their giant of a leader was kneeling before her. Kayla's chest heaved, her lungs screaming for air, but she did not allow herself rest. She raised her axe again, preparing to strike, but the warlord lashed out with sudden ferocity. His massive fist caught her across the ribs, sending her sprawling to the ground. Pain exploded through her body, her vision swimming with stars. For a heartbeat she lay there, gasping, her axe fallen from her hands. The warlord rose, his chest heaving, blood streaking his armor. His laughter was hoarse and guttural. "You cannot win," he growled, lifting his sword. "No one defeats me." Kayla forced herself onto her knees, spitting blood into the dirt. Every part of her body screamed for her to stay down, to surrender to the crushing exhaustion. But in the circle of silence she saw the faces of her comrades, men who had mocked her, who had doubted her, now staring with wide eyes filled with something she had never seen directed at her before: hope. She thought of her father's words, the ones that had carried her through every lonely night. Strength will outlast mockery. With a roar that tore from the depths of her chest, Kayla lunged forward, grabbing her axe from the dirt. The warlord's sword came crashing down, but this time she did not meet it head-on. She sidestepped, using his own momentum against him, and brought her axe up in a savage swing. The blade connected with his jaw, tearing through flesh and bone with a sickening crack. The giant reeled, his sword slipping from his hands, his eyes wide with shock. Blood poured from the wound, staining the ground dark. The silence deepened, broken only by the warlord's ragged breaths. He staggered, towering still, but his strength was ebbing, his movements sluggish. Kayla rose fully to her feet, her axe slick with blood, her chest heaving with effort. For the first time she saw the end within reach. He was not a god, not a legend carved in stone. He was a man, broken and faltering before her. And she, the woman mocked for her size, stood unbroken. The warlord tried to raise his hands again, his voice a rasping growl. I will not fall. Kayla stepped closer, her gaze hard as iron, her voice steady despite the roar of blood in her ears. Then I will make you. And with that, she lifted her axe high once more, the armies holding their breath as the duel reached its breaking point. The battlefield was frozen in silence, every eye locked on the circle where Kayla and the warlord faced one another. The giant staggered, blood dripping from his jaw, his massive chest heaving with every labored breath. His sword lay abandoned in the dirt, too heavy now even for his colossal strength to lift again. Yet he still glared at her, pride and defiance burning through the pain. Kayla stood opposite him, her axe raised, her body trembling from exhaustion but her stance unyielding. Every muscle screamed at her to collapse, but she forced herself still. This was the moment everything in her life had been leading toward. The warlord straightened, towering even in weakness, and with a guttural roar charged at her one final time. His massive hands reached out, not for a weapon but for her throat, desperate to crush her with brute force. Kayla met his charge head-on, a cry tearing from her lips. She swung her axe in a wide, merciless arc, putting the last of her strength into the blow. Steel crashed against flesh and bone, the sound splitting the night like a crack of thunder. The axe buried deep into the side of his neck, cutting through sinew and muscle with unstoppable force. For a heartbeat the world seemed to stop. The giant froze mid-charge, his mouth open in a silent roar, his eyes wide with shock. Then, slowly his body gave way. He collapsed forward, crashing into the earth with a weight that shook the ground, dust and blood rising in a cloud around him. The silence stretched longer than any Kayla had ever known. Then, like a dam breaking, the sound erupted. Her comrades let out a deafening roar of triumph, voices carrying across the battlefield with the force of 1,000 drums. Kayla! Kayla! They cried, chanting her name, their disbelief transformed into awe. For years they had mocked her, dismissed her, laughed at her size, but now before their very eyes she had accomplished what none of them had ever dared. She had slain the unstoppable, brought down the monster whose shadow had hung over them all. On the other side the enemy soldiers faltered, their formation collapsing like brittle glass. Fear rippled through their ranks, men stumbling back, dropping their weapons as their leader lay broken in the dirt. The warlord who had been their pillar of terror was gone, and with him their will to fight. Some tried to flee into the night, scattering like leaves in a storm, while others sank to their knees, stunned into paralysis. The battle was over. Kayla stood over the fallen body, her chest heaving, her arms heavy as stone. Blood soaked her axe, ran down her hands, streaked her face, but she did not falter. She looked down at the giant, the once mighty leader now reduced to nothing more than flesh and failure. Her own body screamed with agony, every bone and muscle burning, but inside her chest a fire burned brighter than pain. She had done it. She had turned every insult, every cruel laugh into fuel, and with it she had carved her place into history. Her comrades surged toward her, surrounding her with cheers, their faces alight with awe and respect. Men who had once laughed at her bulk now reached to clap her shoulders, to raise her name like a banner in their mouths. You saved us, one breathed, his voice trembling. Another, one of her worst tormentors, shook his head in disbelief. Gods forgive me. I thought you were a burden. But you're the strongest of us all. The words washed over her, and though pride swelled in her chest, Kayla only nodded, her expression calm. She did not need their praise. The proof lay at her feet. Still, as she stood there, the chanting of her name echoing like thunder, Kayla felt something deeper stir within her. It was not just victory. It was release. For years she had carried the weight of their laughter, the sting of their cruel words. Tonight, with every strike, with every drop of blood she had spilled, she had cast those chains aside. She was no longer the subject of mockery. She was a warrior, proven not by beauty or grace, but by unbreakable strength. The enemy camp erupted into chaos as their soldiers scattered. Kayla's comrades surged forward with renewed courage, sweeping across the field to secure the victory. But still she stood by the warlord's body, staring at the fallen titan. The legend was broken, the mountain toppled, the storm passed. She whispered softly, too low for anyone else to hear. Strength outlasts mockery. The words of her father, now fulfilled. She pulled her axe free from the warlord's neck with a wet, sickening crack. The weight of it nearly pulled her down, but she steadied herself, lifting it high above her head as the chant of her name rose again. The night sky echoed with the sound, carrying it far beyond the battlefield. Kayla, mocked and ridiculed for her size, now stood as the savior of her people, the woman who had done what no man dared. She had taken down the giant enemy leader, and with him the shadow that had haunted them all. The clash in the canyon left both sides reeling, but Alira knew it was far from the end. As dawn broke, the battlefield was littered with broken weapons, wounded allies, and the bitter scent of ash from the enemy's scorched earth attacks. She had fought bravely, her small form darting between hulking brutes like a shadow of vengeance, but the weight of the enemy's endless reinforcements pressed heavily on her mind. For every one she felled, it seemed two more appeared from the horizon, driven forward by the giant leader who still commanded them with iron resolve. The thought gnawed at her. What if her courage was not enough? What if the tide of sheer numbers swallowed everything she had built? Yet despair was a luxury she could not allow. She walked among the survivors, offering words of reassurance, tightening bandages and sharing scraps of food. Many were astonished by her calmness, for they had seen her fight and expected her to be collapsing with exhaustion. Instead, she projected determination. Her allies needed more than swords and arrows, they needed hope, and she intended to give it to them. Still, when she was alone, the weight pressed in. She questioned whether the mocking laughter of the past, those voices that had belittled her for being too small, too weak, still lingered in the air around her. But each time doubt rose, she crushed it. She had already proven them wrong countless times. She would do so again. That evening, as the setting sun painted the canyon walls in crimson, a scout rushed into camp. His voice was frantic, his eyes wide with terror. The enemy leader, the towering brute named Dargoth, was rallying his strongest warriors for one final strike. They would not wait for attrition to drain Alira's resistance. Instead, they meant to break her force with overwhelming violence and crush her beneath their boots. Whispers spread among her companions, fear settling in like a disease. But Alira stood tall. She had always known it would come to this, not a battle of armies, but a confrontation between her and Dargoth himself. That night, as the others prepared for what might be their final fight, Alira sat alone on a ridge, gazing at the stars. The silence of the universe stretched endlessly above her, and she felt small again as she had in her childhood when she had been mocked by those larger and stronger. But rather than despair, she felt a curious peace. Being small had never stopped her. It had taught her resilience, creativity, and courage. She realized now that her size was not her weakness, it was her weapon. Dargoth's immense bulk and strength were terrifying, but they also made him predictable, slow, and overconfident. She would use every lesson of her life, every scar of mockery to strike him down. When the battle began the next morning, it was as if thunder had descended into the canyon. The enemy surged forward in waves, their armor glinting like black fire under the sun. Alira's fighters met them with everything they had. Arrows darkened the sky, blades clashed in furious sparks, and cries of pain and fury echoed against the stone walls. But Alira had eyes only for one figure. Dargoth towered above his soldiers, his voice booming commands, his massive war axe carving through the chaos like a storm. Each swing felled multiple warriors, and his presence seemed unstoppable, a mountain of fury crushing everything in his path. Alira moved swiftly, weaving through the melee, her small frame slipping unnoticed between enemies locked in combat. She avoided direct clashes, conserving her strength, her eyes fixed on her true target. When finally she reached the edge of the battlefield where Dargoth roared his commands, she felt the weight of the moment settle over her shoulders. He noticed her then, his massive head turning, eyes narrowing with both amusement and disdain. He barked a laugh that shook his chest. You? The little insect who thinks herself a leader? I will end this farce with one swing. His army jeered around him, echoing his mockery, and for a heartbeat, it was as though every insult from her past returned in cruel unison. But Alira did not flinch. Instead, she stepped forward, lifting her blade. Her voice carried across the chaos. You call me small as though it is weakness. But it is you who will fall. For you are blind to what size can never measure. Courage, speed, and the will to endure. Her words silenced the jeers, if only for a moment, and even Dargoth paused. But then his rage returned, and he lunged, swinging his axe down at her with bone-shattering force. The ground split where the weapon struck, but Elira had already moved, darting aside with the speed of wind. Each strike that followed met only air or stone. She danced around him, each movement fueled by years of survival against impossible odds, every taunt from the past forged into determination. He grew angrier, his swings wilder, his strength working against him as his fury made him careless. The battle raged around them, but in that circle, all eyes turned to the duel. Allies and enemies alike stopped to watch the small warrior face the giant, their fates hanging on the outcome. Elira knew she could not overpower him head-on. She aimed instead for precision, striking at his exposed joints, darting in to cut and retreat before he could retaliate. Her blade bit into his wrist, then his knee, weakening him blow by blow. The giant roared, staggered, but still swung with terrible force. Each time she narrowly escaped, feeling the air split beside her. Sweat dripped into her eyes, her limbs ached, but she pressed on, refusing to give in. She was fighting not just for herself, but for every soul who had ever been told they were too small to matter. The duel had only just begun, but already the tide of the entire war seemed to hinge on this fragile thread. The battlefield had shifted, but the war was not yet won. After defeating the enemy's giant leader in a stunning display of courage and strength, Alina found herself standing in the center of chaos. Around her, soldiers were still fighting tooth and nail, their swords clashing and shields shattering. The enemy, though shaken by the fall of their champion, was far from retreating. Instead, rage seemed to fuel them, and they charged with renewed desperation. Alina, still catching her breath, gripped her sword and lifted it high, signaling to her allies. "Hold your ground. Do not let them break you." Her voice carried above the clamor of battle, steady and commanding. Her comrades, who moments ago were close to despair, now roared in unity, rallying behind her strength. They had seen her accomplish the impossible. If she could slay the towering beast of a man who had mocked her, then surely they too could rise above their own fears. The tide began to shift. With every push, Alina led her forces deeper into enemy lines. She no longer fought merely to defend herself. She fought for the promise of survival, for the dignity of every soldier who had been underestimated, and for the countless villagers who prayed for their safe return. Sweat mixed with blood on her armor, but she refused to yield an inch. Each strike of her blade became a declaration that size, intimidation, and cruelty could never crush determination. But the enemy was cunning. They had lost their leader but not their strategist. Hidden among their ranks was the second in command, a ruthless commander known as Varric. Unlike the fallen brute, Varric did not rely on size or strength. His weapon was deception. From a distance, he studied Alina carefully, watching the way she moved, waiting for a moment when her energy would waver. He knew that the spirit of the army hinged on her survival. Cut her down and chaos would consume them once more. As Alina pressed forward, she felt an unsettling shift in the air. Her instincts whispered that danger lurked beyond what she could see. Then, like a shadow gliding across the battlefield, Varric appeared. His twin blades shimmered as he struck with lethal precision, forcing Alina back several steps. Unlike the giant leader she had slain, Varric moved like smoke, fast, elusive, and merciless. "You think you've won because you toppled a brute?" Varric sneered as their swords clashed. "But I am not him. I am what he could never be: skill, speed, and strategy. Your victory was a fluke, nothing more." Alina narrowed her eyes, locking her focus. Her muscles ached from hours of battle, but she stood her ground. "If you think words will weaken me, you're wrong. I don't fight for glory. I fight for those who stand behind me. And I won't fall to you." Their duel was unlike anything the soldiers had seen. The clang of steel against steel rang louder than the cries of battle. Sparks lit the air each time their blades met. Varric struck with blinding speed, spinning and weaving with precision, forcing Alina to adapt quickly. He mocked her size with every attack, trying to remind her of her supposed disadvantage. Yet Alina had learned from her past battles. She used her size not as a weakness but as a foundation of strength. Her blows carried weight, her stance never faltered, and her endurance outlasted even the swiftest strike. Still, Varric was dangerous. With one sudden move, he slipped past her guard and cut across her arm, drawing blood. Pain seared through her, but she refused to cry out. She stepped back, steadying her breath, and tightened her grip on her sword. She remembered the countless insults she had endured, the mockery of being called too heavy, too slow, too unworthy. Every scar of ridicule became fuel now, and she channeled it all into the fight. "You're slowing down," Varric taunted, circling her. "You'll break soon enough. And when you do, so will your army." Alina's lips curled into a defiant smile despite the pain. "No. It's you who will fall because you underestimate me, just like your leader did. And underestimation is the deadliest weakness of all. Summoning the last reserves of her strength, she launched forward with a ferocity that caught Varric off guard. Her heavy strike forced him into a defensive role, and she pressed the attack relentlessly, her sword slicing the air with determination. Varric dodged, but his smug expression faltered as Alina's momentum grew unstoppable. She drove him back step by step, her presence unyielding, her will unbreakable. Finally, in a single decisive motion, Alina feigned a stumble, luring Varric into lunging at her exposed side. But it was a trap. She twisted her body, redirected his blade, and drove her sword deep into his chest. His eyes widened with shock as he staggered back, dropping his weapons. For the first time, silence fell over the battlefield as both armies watched. Varric collapsed to the ground, his arrogance dissolving with his final breath. Alina stood tall, her sword still gleaming, her chest heaving from exhaustion. But her voice remained steady as she shouted to her comrades, "They are broken. Press on. Victory is ours." The roar of her soldiers shook the battlefield. The enemy's spirit crumbled with the fall of their commander, and panic spread through their ranks. Those who had once fought with ferocity now faltered, their will shattered. Alina's forces surged forward with renewed determination, driving the enemy into retreat. For the first time since the war began, hope burned bright in every soldier's heart. And it was because of her, the warrior who had been mocked for her size, yet rose to become the symbol of their strength. But Alina knew the battle was not fully over. Though they had turned the tide, shadows of greater challenges still loomed beyond the horizon. The battlefield was shrouded in dust and smoke, the remains of war machines burning in the distance. Ilara stood at the edge of the ruined plain, her chest heaving from exhaustion, yet her spirit burning brighter than ever. All around her, soldiers stared in awe. The woman they had once mocked for her size was no longer seen as weak or clumsy, she was their hope, the one who had brought the impossible within reach. But the war was not yet won. Across the battlefield, rising from the wreckage, came the shadow of the enemy's greatest force, the Titan warlord himself, leader of the invading armies. His towering frame dwarfed even the largest men, his armor forged from black steel, his weapon a massive axe that could cut through entire battalions. The soldiers of Ilara's side froze at the sight, their morale wavering. For them, the appearance of the warlord was the signal that all was lost. For Ilara, it was the moment she had been waiting for. The warlord's voice boomed like thunder, carrying over the battlefield. "So this is the woman who dares defy me? This little creature who thinks her bulk is strength? You are nothing before me, and I will crush you with my own hands." His army roared behind him, their chants filling the air. But Ilara did not flinch. Her heart pounded, yet she stepped forward, each stride heavy but unshaken. She raised her sword, its blade still gleaming with the light of her victories, and shouted back, "You mocked me once, as they all did. You thought my size weakness. Today you will learn it is the strength that ends you." The soldiers behind her erupted in cheers, their fear replaced by fire. Ilara was not just fighting for herself anymore, she carried the spirit of every soldier who had been underestimated, every soul who had been told they were not enough. The clash began with a tremor. The warlord charged, his axe swinging in an arc so powerful that the very air cracked. Ilara met him head-on, her blade striking the shaft of his weapon, sparks flying as steel ground against steel. The ground shook beneath them, and the sheer force of his blow pushed her back a step. But she held firm. Her strength, honed from years of bearing the weight others mocked, was now her greatest weapon. She gritted her teeth and pushed forward, forcing the giant to stagger. For the first time the warlord's eyes widened. He had expected her to fall, but instead she stood unyielding. The duel raged, each strike echoing like thunderclaps across the plain. The warlord's axe carved deep scars into the earth, but Ilara moved with precision, her heavy frame giving her balance and power rather than slowness. She ducked, pivoted, and countered, her sword biting into his armor again and again. Still, he was a titan, and with every strike he sought to overwhelm her. Sweat stung her eyes, her muscles burned, yet she refused to falter. Each breath she drew was filled with the memory of the jeers she had endured, the laughter that had haunted her. Each blow she delivered was an answer to those who doubted her. She fought not only for victory but for every scar her spirit had carried. Finally, the warlord lifted his axe for a strike meant to end everything. He raised it high, the blade catching the glow of fire and sun, his roar echoing through the chaos. But in that moment, Ilara saw her chance. She planted her feet firmly, her strength surging from the ground itself, and as he brought the axe crashing down, she twisted her body, swinging her sword with every ounce of will she possessed. Her blade struck true, cleaving through the weak point in his armor at his side. The warlord bellowed in shock and pain, stumbling back, his massive weapon falling from his hands. The battlefield went silent as he dropped to one knee, his towering form collapsing under the weight of her strike. Elara, chest heaving, stood above him, her sword poised at his throat. "You called me nothing," she said, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. "But I am the strength you could never understand." With one final thrust, she ended him, her blade piercing through the armor that had once seemed invincible. The warlord fell, his body crashing to the earth with a resounding finality. The enemy army, witnessing their leader's fall, broke into chaos. Some fled, others dropped their weapons in surrender. The battle was over, not through sheer numbers or strategy alone, but through the will of one woman who had turned her greatest flaw into her greatest weapon. The silence that followed was broken by cheers, thunderous, overwhelming cheers that rose from Elara's army. Soldiers rushed forward, raising their weapons in triumph, calling her name again and again. For them she was no longer mocked, no longer doubted. She was their champion, their savior, the one who had turned despair into victory. Elara lowered her sword, her chest rising and falling as she looked at the horizon, the sun breaking through the smoke. She thought of all the times she had been made to feel small despite her size, the endless whispers and cruel laughter. Now the world saw her for what she truly was. As the soldiers gathered around her, lifting her high on their shoulders, Elara realized that her story was no longer her own. It belonged to everyone who had ever been underestimated, dismissed, or mocked. She had proven that greatness was not bound by appearance, that strength was not measured by how one looked but by the heart that burned within. The battlefield that day would be remembered not for the fall of the warlord but for the rise of the woman who defied every expectation and rewrote what it meant to be a hero. And as Elara gazed upon the victorious horizon, she knew that this was only the beginning of her legend. The end.